Is too much oil in your engine bad? Well, everybody knows that when you talk about engine oil in a vehicle, it's the lifeblood of a car. So we pop up the hood and you can check your oil quite easily. Obviously, here's where you would add the oil, here's where you check the oil. What would cause a car to be too high in oil? Well, maybe you recently took the vehicle in for an oil service, and sometimes they have those machines and they release the oil, and sometimes they don't stop it quick enough and it actually adds another quart of oil or a half quart of oil, sometimes before it shuts off. So that could be a reason why it's bubbling over. Another reason could be, in fact, unfortunately, if there's contamination you might have mixing, or there's coolant that winds up in the oil that ends up raising the level, but that's an abnormal condition. For the most part, engine oil should only stay the same or slightly drop with time, because generally vehicles aren't sealed perfectly and often they consume a small, minute amount of oil. However, with that said, adding too much oil or having too much oil in your engine, is it a bad thing? So having too little oil is obviously a bad thing, because oil is the lifeblood. That's truly the lubricating surface. So you have parts that are moving inside the engine and surfaces that need to be lubricated as they rub up and down. The pistons, the rings ride along in the cylinder walls, and they need a little bit of lubrication in there so they don't grab and they're not jarring. The bottom end of the engine as well needs lubrication, because there's rod bearings and you need that lubricating surface between that interface between the bearings, the journals, and you just need everything to flow nice and easy. That's why oil is there. So having too little oil clearly will toast your engine. It literally can. If you run too low oil, if you're below the minimum mark on your engine oil dipstick for too long, you could actually find yourself in a world of hurt. Now, what are some symptoms of too low oil? You may actually experience some engine noises, some ticking, some abnormal sounds. Sometimes you may even get a check engine light, or the vehicle may even stall or seize entirely. If it seizes because of too little oil, you've probably done irreversible damage and you've probably destroyed the engine wholeheartedly. So clearly, running too low oil is bad, bad, bad. However, when we talk about too much oil, is that a bad thing? Well, let's take a look here. I'm going to pull out this dipstick right here, and you can check this quite easily. So you check your engine oil like this. So you take it out, rub it off like that, then put it back in, pull it back out now, and then look, and it should fall between, on this car, should fall within those hash marks. With this particular vehicle, every vehicle is a little different, but there's usually a range of hash marks that it has to fall within. So the engine oil should be somewhere in there, and it shouldn't be way up here, for example, or way up here. What you don't want to have is 1, 2, 3 quarts of oil too much. Sometimes people think more is better. Well, actually with engine oil, more is not better. More is sometimes catastrophically bad. So what are some symptoms? If you're not checking your dipstick, what other types of symptoms would you anticipate that you might see or experience if you have too much oil? Well, for example, you might actually have some weird engine noises you haven't typically heard, because it does actually create noise in the bottom of the engine, which we'll explain momentarily. But you could get strange engine noises. You could get smoke wafting out of the engine bay. You could get actually smoke that you'll notice in the cabin here. You might see the oil pressure light on your gauge. You could actually see that illuminate, or a check engine light. Or you might actually see oil start to seep down on the ground. If you look under the engine right there, you might actually start to see oil pooling up somewhere on the ground or dripping, and all that excess smoke does often mean that you've compromised some engine seals because of too much oil. You could even see possibly smoke down at the tailpipe end right here. Down there you see the tailpipe. You may actually see some blue smoke coming out of there. If there's too much engine oil in that engine, it could release through that side, and that's a result of having too much engine oil sometimes. So what is really happening when your oil is too full that's actually causing engine damage? Well, there's a few things going on. Number one, if your oil level's too high, remember, a crankshaft is the rotating mass at the bottom of the engine. That's what drives your pistons and your connecting rods. And the counterweights of that go into the oil at the base of the sump of the engine. So it's in there scooping up oil. The problem is if you have too much oil, it does a couple of things that aren't all that great. That crankshaft then starts rotating in too much oil, and it starts to create a lot of bubbles, foaming and bubbles, which isn't good, because that foaming and bubbles winds up in the oil pump. And an oil pump, have you ever heard of having to prime a pump? Well, that's because a lot of pumps don't like to pull air through it. And if you've got foamy oil going through it, it's like it's not getting a proper prime. And again, if it's not getting all the right oil to all the places that you need it, like in the top of the engine where you got to lubricate upper end parts, piston rings where you have to lubricate all the other components like cam lobes, camshafts, and all of the other bits and pieces that require that lubrication just don't get it properly. It comes intermittently. And if you're running dry, remember, thinking about the higher the RPM, 2,500, 3,500, 4,000, 5,000 RPM, spins that even faster, creates even more foam, more froth. And when it does that, that usually means more potential for failing in the engine, of course. So that's one key factor. So it creates that bubbling effect. It also creates elevated oil pressure in certain spots, which isn't good. And also it does other things, unfortunately. It could, because it increases oil pressure, pushes the oil level pressure up into the combustion chamber. It forces it up there, and what it ends up happening is sometimes it winds up with some oil in the combustion chamber, and as I mentioned, what you have is a situation where you have blue smoke coming out of the exhaust because of this. This is a spark plug here. So the spark plug gets oil film on the electrodes, and then that starts to burn. If that starts to burn that film of oil, you're going to resulting in oil smoke coming out of the tailpipe. And unfortunately, that's one thing, but if it's not getting a complete combustion, in other words, if the spark doesn't completely bridge or it doesn't work because there's too much oil film on there, it might misfire. Might mean a misfire, check engine light, and a problem, a running problem. So you may actually have a bigger issue. So there's yet another thing that goes on when you have too much oil in the engine. Increased crankcase pressure in the engine, of course, as I mentioned already, it's elevated. And when you put too much pressure, it wants to push outwards. Well, there's all kinds of oil seals all over the engine that keeps the oil into the engine. But if you create too much pressure, not just floating, but actually positive pressure in the crankcase, that then pushes oil past. And sometimes if you have weak gaskets, you can then result in some oil leaks. And of course, seals, gaskets. We also talk about valve guide seals. You can leak them through there, and then you have irreversible damage there, or permanent damage with the result of even leaks around the bottom barrel or the bottom of the engine, where it starts to weep out of the bottom of the case, where that case meets with the oil tank. That's where you can start seeing leaks as well, or any other host of issues. It can create leaks, oil smoke, contamination, misfire, check engine lights, and of course lots of engine knocking and banging noises. So clearly too much oil is bad. Too little oil is bad. And that's why there's that range. When you look at the range on the dipstick, that is that limit from the bottom of that range to the top of the range. Most cars are about a quart to a quart and a half difference. Some vehicles, if they're higher performance engines and they use more oil, you might have from the bottom to the top might be 2 liters of oil, but you're in that range. If you're at the bottom and you add a liter, you're probably not going to overfill. So that's probably okay. So if you're down here, make sure add half liter and check again, but you might be good up to about a liter of add. So how do you validate whether your oil's too high or not? So first thing what you want to do is get your car parked on a flat level surface. And with that, then you want to make sure the car is cold, so it's had enough time. Maybe it sit for an hour or sit overnight. Then you pull the dipstick out in the morning on a flat level surface. You check that, and that's the best way to check your oil level for most vehicles. Most vehicles that have wet sumps. If you're driving cars like Ferraris and McLarens that have dry sump engines, you actually have to heat them up, but that's another story. Most engines like this, you basically check them cold, flat surface, pull it out, and that will give you a pretty good telltale. If in fact you're a little bit low, as I mentioned, top it up. I would put smaller amounts in there, run the engine, let it settle, check it a couple of times. If it's too high, there's a couple of ways you can remove that oil. Number one, through the dipstick hole, you can literally pull that out, and they make pumps that you can stuff a pump in there and you can pull some of the oil out of the top. Or you do the easy way and you go underneath, jack the car up, and you actually undo the drain bolt enough so it starts to weep, or maybe just get a hold of it and just let it drip out a little bit and put it back in, and then retighten, wipe it and clean, and you're good to go. Now the problem is, people ask, well, if I just realize it's too high, can I drive my car to the oil service place or my buddy's mechanic shop or some other place, or my shop or the dealer, to actually lower the level? I'm going for an oil change anyway. Well, do you realize it won't take many miles to actually potentially damage an engine? So if you're a quart or 2 quarts high because your buddy was doing you a favor and doing you a solid by doing you an oil service, and he overfilled it by 2 liters, driving it across town may actually be all it takes to destroy that engine. So yes, you need to deal with it right away, and no, you shouldn't drive with too high an oil level. How much is too high? If you're a quarter of a liter over, you're probably fine. Maybe up to a half liter over, you're probably fine. But it's when you get into that liter over, 2 liters over, 3 more, that's when you're guaranteed going to start subjecting your engine to some serious problems. And hopefully it helped all of you with that age-old question if too much engine oil is a bad thing. In fact, it is. As well, if you want learn a little bit more about your vehicles, you're definitely going to want to check that video out where I talk specifically whether it's good or bad to actually extensively idle the engine in your vehicle. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.